reading today is from Acts chapter 1, verses 21 through 26. So, one of the men who have accompanied us during all the time that the Lord Jesus went in and out among us, beginning from the baptism of John until the day he was taken up from us, one of these must become a witness with us to his resurrection. So they proposed two: Joseph, called Barsabbas, who was also known as Justus, and Matthias. Then they prayed and said, Lord, you know everyone's heart. Show us which one of these two you have chosen to take the place in this ministry and apostleship from which Judas turned aside to go to his own place. And they cast lots for them, and the lot fell on Matthias, and he was added to the 11 apostles. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Ed. I'm going to tell you a story today I've never told before. I had a good friend in college. We were both Christian, both competent speakers, and both thought we could make a difference in the church. And we realized one of us was destined to be a minister one day. One of us was going to let a system control and limit where we would live and what jobs we would take, along with our social life. And one of us would have the freedom to choose our own path. One of us would let the church dictate our next steps, and the other would be free and fancy-free in the world. So one night we gathered with some friends, we pulled out some scissors, and we cut straws into various lengths. We had someone hold it so they were all flat on the top, and the length of each was hidden in their grip. And we took turns drawing, and we each took one. And whoever had the shortest straw, I know, it's completely unbelievable. It's hard to even sell that story. Really? That's how a future career, a path, a calling gets dictated? It sounds unbelievable. But we just read it in Scripture. Maybe it doesn't sound as crazy because we just saw the ascension of Jesus in the Scriptures. Maybe Pentecost is the next story, so this one in the middle doesn't sound quite as crazy. But it is. It seems almost ridiculous. So why do we act like it's not crazy when we read it in the Bible? There's a lot of ways to read this text. But for the most part, it sounds ridiculous. Except for the little part where maybe it's not. Bear with me. It's easy to read this and think, it doesn't matter who they choose. They're not even taking it seriously. But you could also read it this way. It doesn't matter who they choose. God was going to work through them regardless. It doesn't matter which person they selected, whoever's gifts came into the circle, God would match them. I've spent years wrestling with this word calling in the church. Calling. We talk about it with ministers often. You're called to do this ministry. And there is a sense of that, a sense of purpose that comes with it. But I also know a lot of people who've gone into ministry for different reasons who've done effective work. I also know some people who feel deeply called to ministry who've done a lot of damage. I know a lot of people who felt called to ministry who've made fantastic real estate agents, who became fantastic parents and gave up their career for their families or to care for a loved one. I've seen people who never felt they were called to do anything transform the world in ways they never imagined. This word calling sometimes starts to divide who can and can't do. Well, I'm not sure if I'm called. No one's sure. Short of Moses in a burning bush and some guys in a fishing boat that had Jesus show up and say, hey, you want to go with me? The rest of us feel like they drew lots to find out who's supposed to do this. And that feels like it's pretty accurate as you listen to most people who found their way into ministry, nonprofit work. A lot who find themselves running for office. Others who find themselves as educators, leaders, caregivers. It's more accidental fumbling into it than anything. It's like, oh, they rolled the dice and here I am. My mom felt called. She was the first in her family to go to college. From there, she was encouraged to look at higher education beyond that, chose a master's degree, thinking she could serve the church, went to Hartford, Connecticut, Hartford Seminary, one of the greatest schools at the time for theological education, and they encouraged her to get a master's degree in Christian education, and then go serve the church alongside the real ministers. Men with a master's of divinity, which means they took a preaching and a counseling class. That's the only difference. I've looked back at her transcript. Same degree, other than a couple of preaching classes, a couple of counseling classes. Mom did it, and then she went to serve the church. And predictably enough, men with power dismissed her, patronized her, made her job hard, belittled her and demeaned her, and she said, forget it. She went back home to take a break. Luckily met a really nice guy. I didn't always think so when I was a teenager, but he turned out to be great. Had a family, settled in and served as the interim Christian ed director between every associate minister they had. It was a boom or bust trend. Things would boom during the gap. Then they would get a new associate minister for faith formation and Christian education, and things would go. Finally, a new senior minister said, there's a trend here. When we have Pat, it goes well. When we don't, things go to pot. Let's keep her. And so they did. They made her director of Christian education. She eventually was overseeing a children's ministry staff person and a youth ministry staff person. She was running all the social stuff of the church, senior adult ministry, and travel trips. The senior minister knew he had a good thing, and he knew not to step on her toes and get in her way. He empowered her to do ministry. Along the way, an older woman in the denomination, a woman, saw another woman who had not been given the recognition she should have and said, why were you never ordained? I said, well, they told me to get a master's in Christian education. She goes, yes, but you're doing more work than most ordained people. I said, yeah. So let's have you take some counseling classes and some preaching classes and we'll ordain you. My mom made it through one semester, one counseling class, and felt so patronized by taking it that she said, you know, my status as a real minister is your all's issue, not mine. I've got work to do, so I'm not going to do more classes. And what she might as well said is, I have ministry to do while y'all talk about stuff. They voted in that meeting to ordain her, regardless of any classwork. So in 1992, 30 years after going to seminary, she was ordained. And now she could do real ministry. Yeah, it sounds ridiculous, right? It sounds ridiculous. So in my ordination process, when I was asked, what happens if you're not ordained? And I said, well, honestly, I'm a man. I'll go work as a Christian ed director somewhere and somebody will pay me, and probably unfairly, just as much as anybody else. I mean, it's not fair, but it's probably what will happen. And one of the people in the room said, I hope if you are ordained that you feel the Spirit move on you like we have. That you understand the power of this call and the importance of it. To which I said, are you saying my mom's ministry didn't count for the 30 years you all waited to lay hands on her? I almost got kicked out of the room. It was a little bit of hubris, a little bit of disrespect. But they were using the word call in a way that clearly ignored Acts 1, that clearly didn't pay attention to history, and to me was elevating clergy and real ministry in a way that only real ministers tend to do, or only people who've been told that ministers are special and need to be elevated are taught to do. It's a power dynamic. It's an unfair shift that's not there in Scripture. The disciples don't get it more often than the masses. If they're the closest thing we have to clergy coming out of the Jesus movement, it's those who are most equipped who often understand the least. And it's people like the woman at the well, the Syrophoenician woman, Nicodemus coming at night and begging for extra information. It's people who get it and dig more, who are outside the circle. Do you really think in any of my mom's years of ministry, people said, gosh, she made such a difference, but imagine what she could have done if she were ordained from the beginning? Imagine someone saying, you know, I'm glad she came to pray with us when our child was sick. Too bad it wasn't the real minister. You think anybody ever sat with a friend holding their hand and said, boy, I wish this person were more credentialed to be present with me? On September 11th, 2001, I was getting ready in the morning to go to the church office. Then unimaginable events took place on the news, and I was frozen in front of the TV for a bit. The more I watched, the more I realized I needed to get to the church office. Along the way, I got a phone call. High schools were allowing students to go home if their parents would dismiss them or pick them up. Jane was a high schooler in my youth group. Her parents were both therapists. One was a therapist for clergy. They expected they would be having a long day. They gave the school permission for me to check her out. So I swung by the school, picked up Jane, and we headed to the church. Jane answered phone calls all day, and I talked to church members, a few that Jane passed through to me when she could, others that were walking by and coming into the church needing a place to be. The senior minister was on vacation. The associate minister was out of town for a conference. I was the only real minister on duty, and I was not yet ordained. It was the office administrator, the youth minister, and a high schooler. That's all a church of 500 people had. And no one asked if we were qualified that day. No one cast lots to see which of us they would talk to, and no one said, but I drew the other straw. On this day in this place, God was at work. And I can testify to the fact that there are folks who talked to a high school junior that day and thought they were talking to a pastor. There were people who talked to a church administrator who thought they were getting a minister. Or they just talked to the first person who answered the phone and they did not care. God was at work, regardless of how prepared, qualified, or official we were. There's a similar story a couple thousand years ago, right? Jesus has turned Jerusalem upside down and inside out, transformed the lives of many. Jesus dies and then is back and then is gone, and it's traumatic. Judas has been following Jesus, argued with Jesus, betrayed Jesus, and now killed himself in response to everything that's happened in his own life. It was traumatic. The people around them, those left, had clearly been experiencing more in those 40 days than anyone can expect them to manage. And in the midst of their trauma, in the midst of the chaos, they concluded that there really should be 12 people. There were 12 tribes of Israel. There had been 12 apostles along the way. The thing they had to fix in that moment, of all the things to fix, was we need another apostle. Focusing on what we can control in the midst of uncontrollable events, right? They narrowed the list to 2, and then they let God decide Vegas style. It sounds ridiculous, right? But what if it's not? Not really. What if we put way too much authority in titles instead of those who show up? In sports, there's an expression some of you may be familiar with. The best ability is what? Availability. You might be 7 foot tall and able to shoot 3-pointers and run faster than anybody, but if you're hurt, you're no good to anybody. Availability is the best ability, says every fantasy football fan ever who's tried to put their little team together on Sunday mornings and said, but all my players are hurt. Yes, they're playing football. It happens. Availability is the best ability. What if we put too much authority in titles and gifts and forget about those who are present? What if we put too much power into systems instead of relationships? What if we put too much emphasis on resumes instead of availability? Often calling is more about answering than a feeling. Often vocation is more about willingness than preparedness. I've got a master's degree and a lot of experience. I've got a decent resume as a minister. But if you think for a second that when someone is grasping at straws in their life, when they feel like they're at their wits' end, when they're grieving, lonely, scared, or insecure, if you think 1 second when someone is looking for God that my credentials mean more than yours, then you have not heard today's story. Think about when the unimaginable has happened to you. Were you looking for someone with authority or someone who knew you? Were you looking for someone with the credentials, or were you looking for someone who would be willing to be present with you? It's not about a resume. God doesn't check them. God gives us experiences that can fill our resume. It's not about your qualifications. God doesn't care how many scriptures you can quote. That's people at a church. God doesn't care how deep your faith runs. That's our issues of judging and dividing. God doesn't care about your qualifications. And neither does the person you're feeding, the person whose hand you're holding, the person you're marching with, advocating for, the person you're praying for or listening to. Ministry is what we all do. Ministry is what we all do. And ministry really is a complex word for God equipping us to do what no one is qualified for. If you want to know why preachers' kids have a bad reputation, it's because they don't see the minister on a pedestal. They know that person has no more authority to make them go to bed than anyone else in the world. So they do what they want and often rebel against those assumptions. In churches, there are way too many people listening to what the minister tells them instead of doing ministry and trusting themselves. There's way too many people abdicating to a person in power instead of trusting the power of God to work through them. Ministry is a complex word for God equipping us all to do what no one is qualified for. No one in Jerusalem was qualified to fill the space left by Judas. No more so than any of the 12 disciples would have been qualified to take over for Jesus. Yet God keeps caring for people in the world. The story keeps getting told. The promise of God's love keeps getting shared. And whether we are grasping at straws, trying to fix a world that seems to be slipping through our fingers, or whether we are drawing straws, hoping the pressure doesn't rest on us today, God keeps caring for people. Somehow the gospel of Jesus keeps transforming the world. So if you volunteer out of the goodness of your heart, if you volunteer for all the good works that you do, good for you. If you find yourself being voluntold to help others, and that's why you've done it, good for you. If you keep helping others despite your best efforts to watch out for number one, good for you. God's equipping you for ministry. If you are only helping others because you are court mandated to do it, good for you. God is equipping you to do it. If you're only helping others because you were there and you didn't know what else to do when someone grabbed your hand, good for you. God is equipping you for ministry. If you resent not being able to do more, if you question why you are invested in this at all, if you wish expectations were clear, if you hope the burden might one day be lifted from you, if you resent the burden of serving people every day, if you have no idea whether you believe in God or not, if you are unsure about your own qualifications or what you would say, or if you just resent being stuck in these questions at all, it doesn't matter. God's equipping you for ministry. The Spirit will work through you. Despite us, the Spirit does amazing things. We can all serve. We will all serve. We can all be ministers when the moment arrives. Because when the moment arrives, the Spirit arrives. And it doesn't matter who's drawing the straws.